My name's Nikki. I'm the Obsessive Bookseller, and this is going to be my monthly wrap-up for March 2021. I read a lot of heavy books in March this year, and actually a lot of them were carryover from January and February. But the first one I finished was Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. It's the second book in the Minimalism series. I started the book in January of 2019, and read about 5 or 6 chapters and then set it aside for books that were a little easier to get through. And I kept thinking I'd come back to it. And I picked it up again a few months later, got another couple of chapters, and then didn't touch it again until January of this year. It's not that it wasn't a good book. It was just really dense and it took a lot of concentration. And I always had good intentions to get back to it. So that's why it sat on my currently reading shelf on Goodreads for that length of time as well, and I got really sick of seeing it there. Finally, January of this year hit, and I decided, come hell or high water, I was going to finish this book. So I started over and read it cover to cover, and it took me about 3 months. And it was a really good book, worth it. One of the most expansive world building I've read so far. The characters were so interesting and easy to get behind. A lot of them are still kind of enigmas, so I'm looking forward to seeing how they're developed in future books. I found this one a lot easier to follow than the first book. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are a few returning characters from the first book, so we don't have as many new people to keep track of. And I think also a lot of the names and references that he makes in passing I had heard before, so it made it easier to just keep going. But even still, I think I used the Kindle X-ray feature about every page or two to make sure that I kept everything straight. Because I don't know about you, but as soon as I start confusing characters or locations, I start to lose investment in the story. At least as soon as I realize that I've made that mistake. And so it's really hard to go back and reread and get acclimated again once you've gone off the rails. And I'm such a perfectionist. I want to make sure I get the full benefit out of this series because it's so long and it's so dense. So I don't think I'll be rereading it anytime soon. Based on merit alone, the book was a solid 5-star read. If I take into account how long it took me to get through and the experience of reading it, how much concentration it took, I knocked off half a star, so 4.5 stars, which is still pretty good, and I'm told this isn't even the best one in the series, so I'm looking forward to it. The next one I read was The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. It's the 5th book in the First Law World series. Honestly, I don't get a lot of reading confusion these days between different books going at once, but this one and Dead House Gates were so similar that I had to stop and make sure I knew which series I was in at the moment, and that doesn't happen for me often. I really enjoyed this book. It kind of digs deeper into some of the side characters we've met within the first trilogy and brings in one from Best Served Cold, and that's probably my favorite part about it, is that he expands on characters that we've only just kind of skimmed the surface on so far, and he really gives them a lot of depth and meaning. It's basically a battle that takes place in the North. It covers perspectives from every single type of position within a war. So you get the general's perspective, you get his daughter's perspective, you get the grunt's perspective, and you get it from both sides. So it's really this all-encompassing experience. There was one battle scene in particular that I thought was really creatively done. And I tend to get bored with battle scenes in books because I feel like it's just repetition and there's not a lot of focus on overall tactic or strategy. It's just a bunch of hacking. So for a battle scene to not only be unique enough to keep me engaged, but to be creative enough that I've never seen it like that before. And I don't want to give away how it played out because that's part of the experience, and I feel like it would be spoilerish-y to tell you exactly how it was different, but just keep in mind if you ever read this that it's got some really cool creative takes on things. Despite the fact that it was so good, I think this is still my least favorite in the series so far. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that It took me a while to get acclimated with the characters, probably because it bounced around so much. I was about halfway through the book before I really felt invested in any of them. I also missed Glokta from the first trilogy. He's still one of my favorite characters ever. There was one character in this book that was comparable, so it gave like the same inner dialogue and snark, and he was actually my favorite character from this book. By the way, that snark is something I'm starting to look forward to specifically for his books. I don't know what I'm going to do when I finish them, because I love the voice and I love the inner dialogues that he writes with his characters. He has quickly become one of my favorite authors, and I cannot believe I let the first one sit unread on my shelf for over 10 years. So if you like grimdark fantasy and haven't read this series yet, pick it up soon. The first one I read twice, and the first time I read it, I wasn't super impressed. I liked it, but it was just okay. Second time I liked it more, and continuing the trilogy, the initial trilogy, really made me retrospectively love the first book. Give it a try if you haven't. He's considered a staple in the genre for a reason, and he, like I said, he's one of my favorites. 4 out of 5 stars for this book in specific. The next book I read is a new release in January from my favorite urban fantasy writers, Ilona Andrews. It's called Blood Heir, and it's the first book in the spin-off Aurelian Rider series. And it basically covers a side character from the Kate Daniels series, her daughter Julie. They had written a short story about this character early on in the series, and I liked that one okay. I'd heard there was a lot of controversy about writing a Julie novel. A lot of people weren't very excited about it, but I actually found that the twist they gave to the character and the situation they put her in, it kind of refreshed her profile a bit and made it really interesting to dive into. That said, because this is a book that takes place after the full 10 novel series of Kate Daniels plus all the novellas, there was a lot of info dumps. So much explanation. The first half of the book was easily just all, oh, meet a new character, explain their background. Oh, here's something about magic, explain where it came from. And it was just a series of explanations and not a whole lot of plot advancement. So it was kind of hard to get through. There was about halfway through, you kind of figure out the point of the story. And that is where things really started picking up for me, and I enjoyed it from the end. But even still, there was still a ton of explanation scenes. So I'm hoping that if they come out with a second one, they will have explained themselves into the ground and they'll be able to work on plot, because they're some of the best storytellers I've ever read. I love the Hidden Legacy series, and each book just gets better and better. And to date, everything that I've read from them, with the sole exception of the very first book in the Kate Daniels series, I've absolutely loved. So for this one to be a miss is kind of a bummer, but I know the brilliance that they're capable of, so I'm not holding that against them so far. But yeah, this one, way too much explanation. So I'm giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read, and I'm not quite finished with yet, is Million Dollar Demon by Kim Harrison. It's book 15 in the Rachel Morgan Hollows series. And it's funny because this one got a revival. The series ended at book 13, and then the author revamped it no pun intended. She revamped it a few years later. And it's kind of funny. You just have to pretend that the epilogue in the 13th book doesn't exist, and then you'll be just fine. I had mixed feelings at first about reading a series that had been finished and then revisited, but I have to say, she's doing an excellent job with it. The conflict that she created was a natural progression from the original series, and I'm really interested in it. I've discovered I'm really appreciating the slow pacing of her writing. She's got probably the biggest word count and the slowest pacing of any urban fantasy that I've read so far. And there's quite a few of them. I've been dabbling in a lot of them. But what that does is it really slows it down and really lets you immerse in with the character and her world. And each scene is just really lengthy and drawn out. And that may not be what a lot of urban fantasy readers are looking for. They've got like that fast-paced action that you kind of expect from it. And this is not the case with this series. But the benefit, the flip side, is that you get more invested in the character. You get into the flow of it. And when something happens that's supposed to like hit you to the core, it really does. This is not my favorite urban fantasy series, but the moments within it are my favorite single moments in any urban fantasy series, if that makes sense. They really hit you in the feels. This book in specific, I had a lot of fun with it. It feels like coming home, and it was the perfect way to break up all of the heavy, dark fantasy I've been reading lately. I'm just tickled that she's still producing novels that I love and that I have more to look forward to from her. I'm not sure how many books she's planned for the rest of the series, but if she keeps writing them, I'll keep reading them. Okay, on to nonfiction. I actually avoided nonfiction like the plague for most of my life, and then I discovered organization books, and then I got into digital minimalism and trying to figure out how to be more productive and maximize time. So I've been reading a lot of nonfiction over the last couple of years and really enjoying it. If you've seen the Netflix special, The Social Dilemma, you might appreciate the book The Shallows. If you are looking to argue one way or another about what the internet does to our brains, this is a great resource, and I think it would be really useful if you were writing a paper. But as far as new information, I did not find hardly any value in it at all. I read the book to kind of re-emphasize the point to myself that I'm spending too much time connected to technology. And I think he could have taken a couple of paragraphs from each chapter and had a killer blog post, and everything else was just filler and re-emphasizing everything that he had already said. And it was just so repetitious, and I really did not need 10 to 15 examples for each point that he made. So in that regard, this was not a very successful book for me. If you're interested in the subject, I would highly recommend Digital Minimalism by Cam Newport instead. And then they even talk about it pretty well in the book called Make Time. I think I rated this 2 stars on Goodreads, but the longer I think about it, the more I think it was just a 1-star read for me. I did not get any benefit out of it whatsoever. And that could be because I've already been researching the topic pretty heavily. So if it had been my first introduction to the concept, I might have rated it more highly. And finally, I read Unfuck Your Habitat. I read this for a book club over at my favorite bullet journalers channeler, Cindy Guntart-Baldo, and I really enjoyed the book. I'm really into organizing. I love all the decluttering videos. The scope of this book was a little beginner level compared to where I am in my own personal decluttering home organization journey. I'm so much further along that it really didn't give me a ton of new insight. It did talk about this concept of the 2010 idea where you work for 20 minutes and then you take 10 minutes off, then you work for another 20 minutes, take another 10 minutes off. And that actually was quite beneficial to me when I was dealing with health issues. And so if you just take it in little chunks, you get that feeling of accomplishment, and it motivates you to keep going, but you have to do it in little time management so you don't overexert yourself. And I will say the book is really recommendable and really useful for those who are struggling with any kind of inhibiting factors, because it's one thing for someone who's entirely healthy to clean their house on a regular basis. It's a whole nother matter when you have either physical or mental things blocking your way. So in that regard, it is a fantastic book to help you just take baby steps to get to where you want to be. I wish I had read it a year ago when I started having pregnancy problems and could not keep up on my house like I wanted to. My overall rating is a 3 out of 5 stars, with the caveat that to the right person, it'd be a 5-star read across the board. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm really excited about all the things that I've been able to read this month. I've been having a lot of fun this year. I decided to not focus on young adult books and only grab the books that I was most excited to read. And so far, my reading experience has been fantastic. I'm looking forward to my next video, which will be a TBR plan for April. So hopefully I'll see you then. Thanks.